My mother said it at a Sunday dinner in front of 7 people, including 2 aunts I hadn't seen in over a year and a family friend who had known me since I was 4 years old and would go home that evening and tell her own daughter what she had witnessed. She said it the way people say the things they've been thinking for a long time. Not with heat, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat, unguarded confidence of someone who believes so completely in the truth of what they're saying that it doesn't even occur to them to soften it before it leaves their mouth. She said, "We just worry that you haven't really achieved anything yet at your age." And my father nodded, slowly with the air of a man, confirming a medical diagnosis he'd been sitting on for weeks. And the table went on, the way tables go on when someone says the unsayable thing, and everyone decides, collectively, that the most dignified response is to simply continue, passing the bread. 6 months later, my parents called me asking if they could be in the photograph. Not a family photo, a photograph being taken by a professional photographer in a building with my name on it, for a feature in a publication they had subscribed to for 23 years and never once expected to open and find me inside. Stay with me, because what happened between that Sunday dinner and that photograph is not a simple revenge story, and it is not a simple success story either. It is something stranger and more honest than both of those things. And the moment my mother asked to be in that picture is the moment this story becomes about something much larger than whether or not my parents were right about me. If you've ever been told you weren't enough by the people who were supposed to be the last ones to count you out, subscribe right now. Because what I built in those 6 months is going to redefine what the word achievement means to you by the time this story is finished. I need to take you back further than that dinner, because the word yet in my mother's sentence, "We worry you haven't achieved anything yet," at your age, was carrying more weight than one word should reasonably be asked to carry. And you need to understand what she meant by it before you can understand why it landed the way it did. At 30 years old, I was a freelance documentary filmmaker. Not the glamorous film festival version of that sentence, the real, practical paying my own rent version, which meant I spent my time making short documentary content for nonprofits, small local businesses, the occasional municipal project that needed visual storytelling done by someone who cared about the craft and could work within a modest budget. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it in the specific, unflashy way that people know they are good at something, when the evidence is in the work itself rather than in the response the work generates in the rooms they most want to impress. My clients renewed. My referrals grew. The work was getting better every year in ways I could feel even when I couldn't yet fully articulate them. But to my parents, my father, a retired civil engineer, my mother, a former school administrator, what I did existed in a category they had no reliable framework for evaluating. There was no title. There was no company name on my email signature that meant anything to them. There was no clear trajectory they could trace from where I was to somewhere they recognized as a rival. My income was real but irregular, which in my parents' economy of security was functionally indistinguishable from unreliable, and no amount of explaining the nature of freelance creative work ever quite bridged the gap between what they understood success to look like and what my actual professional life contained. I had tried in the early years to translate it for them, to find the vocabulary that would make them see the work the way I saw it. After enough years of failed translation, I had stopped trying and started simply living the life without narrating it for an audience that wasn't going to understand it anyway. So when my mother said what she said at that Sunday dinner, she wasn't being deliberately cruel, and I want to be honest about that, even though the distinction didn't make it hurt any less. She was being genuinely worried, in the limited language of worry available to a woman who had built her entire definition of a good life around markers. I had chosen not to pursue stability, title, the kind of visible, legible achievement that announced itself clearly, enough to be bragged about at the tables of other people's Sunday dinners. She looked at my life and saw absence. She wasn't seeing what was there, but she was absolutely sincere in her concern, which is sometimes the most disorienting kind of wrong a person can be about you, because it removes the option of simple anger and leaves you, instead, with something that requires much more complicated processing. I drove home from that dinner in a silence I didn't fill with music or podcasts, because I needed to sit inside what had just happened long enough to decide what to do with it. And what I decided, somewhere on that 40-minute drive, was nothing dramatic, not a vow, not a declaration, not the kind of cinematic moment where the protagonist sets their jaw and the score swells underneath them. I just decided quietly and with a kind of bone-tired clarity that I was going to stop explaining myself to people who weren't watching closely enough to see what there was to explain, and start doing the one thing I had been putting off for 2 years because it felt too large and too exposing and too much like a bet on myself that I wasn't sure I was ready to make. I was going to make my own film, not for a client, not on someone else's brief, my own documentary about something I had been circling for 2 years without quite committing to landing on a film about the last generation of traditional craftspeople in our region, the woodworkers, the blacksmiths, the textile artisans operating out of small shops and backyard, workshops and converted barns, people whose skills represented an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back generations and who were, almost without exception, aging out of their trades with no one waiting to catch what they knew when they could no longer hold it. If you've ever had an idea living in you for years that you couldn't quite commit to because committing meant finding out whether you were as good as you needed to be to do it justice, comment the long idea below, because that film had been sitting in me for 2 years waiting for exactly this particular painful kind of permission. I started shooting 3 weeks after that dinner, on a Saturday morning in November, in the workshop of a 78-year-old chairmaker named August, who had been making Windsor chairs by hand in the same building for 51 years, and who, when I showed up with my camera and my release form and my nervousness barely contained beneath my professional composure, looked at me for a long moment and said, "You going to let the camera do the work, or are you going to do it yourself?" I told him I was going to do it myself. He nodded once, put his tools back in his hands, and started working, and I started filming, and for the next 4 hours I did the best work I had done in 10 years of doing this professionally. I knew it in real time, which almost never happens. Usually the knowledge that something was good comes later, in the edit, when you can see it with distance. That morning I could feel it while it was happening. The specific aliveness of work that is meeting the full weight of what you are capable of bringing to it. I spent the following 4 months shooting 14 craftspeople across our region. A glassblower in her 60s who had trained in Venice. A third-generation saddlemaker who was the last person in the state still doing hand-stitched leather work at commercial scale. A woman who made traditional Appalachian baskets from white oak splits she harvested and prepared, entirely herself, in a process that took 3 days before she ever touched a weaving frame, and who told me on camera that she had taught the technique to exactly 0 people in 30 years, because nobody had ever stayed long enough to learn the part after the first day. I filmed all of them the way August had watched me that first morning, doing the work myself, without shortcuts, without the distancing trick of letting the equipment carry more than its share of the meaning. The edit took 6 weeks. I worked on it every night after my client work was done, in the particular focused exhaustion of someone who has finally given themselves permission to make the thing they were always supposed to make, and who understands that the permission has a limited window and must be used while it's open. I had no distributor. I had no festival submission strategy. I had a 74-minute film I believed in completely, a hard drive, and a contact list of people I had built over 10 years of working in documentary, film who might know what to do with the first 2 items. I sent it to 11 people. 3 of them responded within a week. One of those 3 was a documentary programmer for a mid-sized regional film festival who had seen my client work over the years and had been apparently waiting for me to make something personal without knowing that's what she was waiting for. She wrote me an email that I have read enough times to have accidentally memorized, in which she said the film was the kind of work that reminded her why she had taken the job she had, and asked if it was available for their upcoming program. I said yes before I finished reading the sentence. The festival acceptance was the first thing, and it was not small, but it was also not the thing that changed the trajectory of what happened next. What changed the trajectory was a woman named Constance, a 71-year-old textile artist who was one of my 14 subjects, who had a nephew who worked in editorial at the Regional magazine my parents had subscribed to for 23 years. She called me 2 weeks after I told her the film had been accepted to the festival, and she said in the direct, unornamented way of a woman who had spent 50 years making things with her hands and had no patience for indirection in any other area of life either. My nephew wants to do a piece about you in the film. I told him you were the real thing. Don't make me wrong about that. I told her I wouldn't. She said good, and hung up, and 3 days later I was on the phone with her nephew, a journalist named David who asked questions with the same quality of attention his aunt brought to her weaving, careful, specific, genuinely interested in the thing underneath the surface of the thing. The piece ran 6 weeks later, in the print edition and online simultaneously, illustrated with stills from the film that the magazine's photo editor had described. I was told secondhand as some of the best documentary photography she had seen in the magazine's pages in years. The feature was 3,000 words, and it was not a puff piece. It was a real examination of the film, of the question it was asking, about cultural memory and craft, knowledge and what a community loses when it stops paying attention to the people who know how to make things with their hands. It took the work seriously in a way that is rarer than it should be, and it put my name, my photograph, and the name of my film on a page my parents would open with their Sunday morning coffee in a house 40 minutes from mine, with no warning from me, because I hadn't told them about any of it, not the film, not the festival, not the feature, for the same reason. I had stopped translating my work for them 2 years ago. Some things need to arrive in their own language without a guide, so the person receiving them has no choice but to encounter them directly. My mother called me on a Sunday morning, and I knew before I answered that she had read it, because she called at 7:42, which meant she had read it before she finished her first cup of coffee, which meant she had not been able to put it down once she started, which told me everything I needed to know about the impact of 3,000 words. That took the work seriously, landing in the hands of a woman who had spent years not knowing how to take it seriously herself. She didn't say I'm sorry immediately, and I didn't need her to. What she said was, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this was happening. And she said it in the specific, quietly undone voice of someone who has just realized that the absence of information they were working from was not a neutral condition, but an active one, that they had been choosing, at every Sunday dinner and every phone call, not to ask the questions that would have told them what was actually there. My father got on the phone, which he rarely does, and said, in the careful, considered way of a man who selects words the way he used to select materials for load-bearing structures, this is a serious piece of work. I didn't know you were doing serious work. Not an apology. Something better, actually. A revision, stated clearly and without qualification, of the assessment he had been operating on. He was telling me he had been wrong, and he was telling me how he had been wrong, which is the only form of being sorry that has any structural integrity. Then my mother asked about the photograph. The feature had mentioned that the magazine was sending a photographer to the festival, premiere for a follow-up visual piece, and she had read that detail and arrived, apparently, at the question I had not anticipated. Could we come? To the premiere? Could we be in the photograph? And I sat with that question for a long moment, because it was doing several things at once. It was asking for access to something they had never expressed interest in before. It became worth accessing, which is a complicated thing to be asked. And it was also, underneath that, asking something more vulnerable and more real. Are we allowed back in? Have we been gone long enough that coming back requires permission? I want to tell you what I said, because I think it's the most important moment in this story, more important than the film or the festival or the feature, more important even than what my mother said at that dinner table. I said, yes, come to the premiere, but I need you to understand something first. I'm not going to spend the evening explaining the work to you. You're going to have to watch it and let it tell you what it is. My mother said she understood. My father said they would be there, and there was something in the quality of that agreement, unhesitating, immediate without negotiation, that told me they were not coming to be seen at something successful. They were coming because they finally understood that they had been missing something real for a long time, and the premiere was the first door that had opened wide enough for them to walk back through. They came on a Friday evening in early spring. My mother in a dress she had clearly chosen carefully. My father in the jacket he reserved for things that mattered. I watched them from across the room when August, the chairmaker, my first subject, found them near the entrance and started talking to them without knowing who they were. And I watched my father's face do something I had never seen it do while talking to a stranger. It went completely, genuinely still. The particular stillness of a man who has stopped managing a conversation and simply fallen into it because August was talking about the film, about what it meant to be seen doing the work he had done, invisibly for 51 years. And my father was listening the way engineers listen. When the load calculations finally make sense, my mother cried during the film, not during the parts I expected, not during the most visually beautiful sequences or the most overtly emotional moments. She cried during a scene with Constance, the textile artist, who looks directly into the camera at one point and says, "The hardest thing about this work isn't the years it takes to learn it. The hardest thing is that people don't see it until it's almost gone, and by then all they can do is grieve it." I think my mother understood, in that darkened room, watching Constance's hands move across the loom, that she had been one of those people, the ones who don't see something until it's almost gone, and that the film was, among many other things, an extended, patient argument against exactly that kind of not seeing. The photograph that ran in the follow-up piece was of me and 3 of my subjects, taken outside the venue after the screening. My parents are not in it, as it turned out. The logistics of the shoot made it impractical. And I think, honestly, my mother understood when the moment came that the photograph was for the film and its subjects, not for the family of the person who made it. But what happened after the photographer left is the moment I keep returning to when I think about what those 6 months actually built. My father found August again at the end of the evening, and they stood together near the door for almost 20 minutes, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the quality of it. 2 older men, one who built structures and one who built chairs, standing in the particular ease of people who have found a shared language they didn't know they both spoke. And my mother stood beside me during that 20 minutes with her hand through my arm, not saying much, just standing there, present in the full weight sense of the word, the way she hadn't been present with me in a very long time. She said before they left, "I want to see what you make next. Not I'm proud of you, not I'm sorry, not any of the sentences I had spent years half waiting for. Just I want to see what you make next." And somehow that sentence